On this episode of the podcast, I have with me two guests. I have Hyung Lee, who is the Director of Business Applications, very Salesforce focused, and I have Chi Ho, who's also a Senior Manager of Business Applications. And we're going to be talking a lot about business systems with the focus on Salesforce. We're going to be diving into topics around how you can extend Salesforce, potentially get yourself in trouble by extending it too far, but yet able to give you quick and dirty solutions to a certain point. We're going to talk about the evolution of the platform. Both these gentlemen are gracious with their time. They're experts in this area, and I'm super excited to have both of you guys on. Thank you.
Thanks, Amir. My name is Hyung Lee. I've been doing application support for 20 plus years. Probably started my career in the Salesforce realm back in 2005, where I worked with Chi. And then we had the fortune of working together at Uber. So I've built, managed teams, worked on Salesforce for many years, and just actually finished my tenure at New Relic, and we'll be starting a new opportunity on Monday.
Awesome. Good luck on the new journey.
Thank you.
And I'm Chi Ho. I've been in the industry, started really with Salesforce. I had a really unique journey, graduate college, and then start really building a platform, understanding business application, had various roles from support to being an architect for partners to sales engineering, and that lead up to managing a business application team at Uber a little less than half a year ago.
Awesome. You guys are definitely the right guests to tackle some of these topics and excited. So let's dive right in. And I guess, before the podcast started recording, we started talking about, I said digital transformation. I said about, what other term can we use but calling it digital transformation? It's industry standard, but really about how business systems are coming to the forefront, right? And becoming central to a lot of companies and kind of driving that innovation. I guess maybe at the top level, we'll get into Salesforce, but just at the high level, when you're looking at business systems and the shift into, some of the core capabilities companies are seeing, what's that been like at some of the organizations that you guys have both worked for?
I think, Amir, it's really, the investment that a lot of companies are making nowadays. In the past, when you think about the evolution of business systems, and really Salesforce too, right? It was an afterthought of an operations. And now you're seeing it being centralized in a central IT organization a lot of times, if not an engineering organization, or even like a business ops organization. So it's become a really central, platform to enable businesses to grow and sell and do a number of things, not just the traditional sales use case, but I've seen Salesforce used in so many different ways in our experience and had the fortune to get our hands dirty in some of those build outs. But it's really, the evolution has really been the realization from the exec teams on the importance of, using Salesforce as a core platform.
And what I've seen as well is really leveraging the technology and turning it into a competitive advantage, because technology really creates a lot of efficiency. So having the same kind of resource and investment into making your business run smoother, there's been a huge uptake recently to really invest to create that extra lever against kind of like competing with their competitors in the market. And the most successful company invests in both areas, the external product and internal business application and tooling to make that happen. And I think that's kind of been the big change, because it's never had enough investment early on. It was more manual. And that's why we call it the digital transformation. How do you turn something that's really kind of not something manual into more automation, to more intelligent, to predictive, really adds that new level of kind of efficiency to companies in the industries.
Yeah, and I guess if you were to take a step back and look at some of where things have started and ended up here, business applications before were solely to help a company run its departments. It's a finance application, everything was siloed. And then you start coming forward with, systems that are at a higher level and people can integrate stuff. And all of a sudden now you have different challenges of having different applications start to kind of grow and get multi-purpose into other uses. And when you talk about the, maybe the executive championing or the CIO or the VP looking for solutions for a particular line, business line or business unit, something like Salesforce is a platform. It almost becomes like a bit of a Swiss Army knife of, what can you do with it? Where can you push it? I guess when you guys are looking at how Salesforce has grown in that sense from maybe some of the earlier implementations to now. Has that been a pretty big quantum leap from the start? And I mean, both of you guys have been doing this for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's like two areas, right? Like the first area is the traditional sales use case. And the evolution of that has been that it's traditionally owned by like a sales ops team. And, years ago, you would just get some eager person that was like, I'll learn it. And then, they sort of maintain, administer it. And then maybe you're lucky enough to actually hire like a Salesforce admin and maybe even a developer. But then that changes hands. And so you have a lot of companies that have grown up that are now enterprise companies, thousands of employees that now have, this huge platform that you can do so much on, but it's been sort of built and managed by, a ton of different people. So now you see actually a lot of companies doing this major transformation and reimplementation of Salesforce. So that's sort of like the traditional like sales or support use cases. I think something Chi and I saw at Uber was really interesting was how a fast growing company can utilize something like Salesforce to move quickly to experiment. We had a lot of different departments use Salesforce that couldn't get engineering resources. We had like a policy team. We had like a comms team. We even had like an investor relations team. I think one of the first things I did at Uber was deduping like celebrities that were investors at Uber, which was interesting. I think I deduped like P. Diddy and Puff Daddy and Sean Combs at one point, which was an interesting exercise.
When you're looking back, and I guess for either of you, when you're looking back at situations where there's a lack of engineering and you can use Salesforce to get something up quick, obviously that starts encroaching on that area of shadow IT, which is sometimes puts IT and business in conflict. Obviously, now I think things are a lot easier because obviously something like Salesforce is something that can be owned by the business. But when you guys are seeing, potentially someone, run with something because obviously they need it, it's a solution that's there. Is that a conflict that you've seen in the past, or is it something that gets pretty much resolved if everyone's in the know early?
That used to be an ongoing battle for us. Business trying to sort of own that versus it being, centralized in an engineering or IT department. Fortunately for us, we maintained that in a central IT department. And I think that actually enabled us to have more resources and move quicker. But I'll let Chi share because he was our engineering manager at Uber. So
That definitely happens. I think it's often overlooked. When it's owned by the business, they're really building for a specific use case or a specific scenario. What's the benefit of having a centralized team is they connect the dots between all these operations and tie them together and make them even better, 10 times more leverage and effectiveness. And that's the benefit of kind of moving toward a centralized team who has that visibility, who are really think about the bigger picture. And that's often underrealized. And I don't blame those businesses because they need to move fast and they have a platform very capable. But at one point, they just will mature. And we always use the words customer 360 to have that visibility on the whole business. And that's when bringing it back together under centralized IT is important. So I never fault the business for starting off on their own, but eventually they need to understand they can, do more and benefit the business more by really having a centralized governance and development team that really are building it for the business as a whole.
I think there's this misconception by a lot of folks on the business side that, you know, centralizing that in IT will make you move slower because you do have to go through some, change management, et cetera, right? But the reality is, you're really making a decision on when do you pay that debt? Do you pay it up front or do you pay it later and come to a standstill because now, you haven't followed, proper security protocols or proper engineering practices, et cetera, and you've hit a roadblock, right? So it's probably better most of the time to pay that up front, you know? And also, Salesforce is an incredibly robust platform. There's still a ton of guardrails. And, if you have a proper engineering team, they can leverage the capabilities so extensively and really make it a robust platform that you can leverage for data insights, to make your sales teams more efficient, to get better reporting, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times, just because you can get a field created quickly doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get the most value out of that, right? So that's sort of the challenge when you're having sort of those debates with your partners on the business side of how quickly you're going to move versus, in a few months from now, what are the benefits from that?
And when you look at that, and obviously the flip side of that debt that you have to pay, whether you do it up front or, and it's probably more expensive the longer you wait. That's almost the antithesis of the speed component of maybe what, let's say when you guys were at Uber and, through your deduping project, you're using Salesforce to get you there. It's almost like it's this friction between that, hey, we got to make sure we do it right. Data governance comes into play versus let's just do it. And that becomes a little bit of a rub.
I could give you a clear example. At New Relic, we spent a year re-implementing Salesforce, and that was 10 plus years of debt that I had to pay. In order to do that, you sort of don't do anything new, for the business. And it's really challenging to do that, especially if you're still at growth company, right? So that's the debt that I'm talking about. And that is just, I mean, millions of dollars, invested to re-implement something that you already have, including, personnel, contractors, and professional services, et cetera. Time spent from, you know, over 100 people probably on that project, right? So it is a huge step that you end up having to pay down the road.
Absolutely. I guess when you're looking at, let's say, an Uber, a New Relic, or DoorDash, and these type of companies that are high growth, and maybe Salesforce is brought in for a specific reason up front, and then it starts. And obviously, Salesforce can do a lot of different things depending on what capabilities you want from it. But as it starts to grow, is it one of those where organically people are like, hey, we need this, and they start looking for solution. It just happens to be Salesforce, or is it a case where, let's say, central IT is now trying to bring the best solution to the table, and obviously Salesforce is one of the options they have.
I think it's both ways. When the problem comes, and it's also the power of the platform, Salesforce platform becomes an obvious choice that they will pick because they can address a lot of different scenario because it is very open and customizable. And that's why it's been such a important platform and it's being adopted rapidly because there's are so only so many platforms out there. There are a ton of one-off kind of application that's designed for one thing, but in reality, business actually need a lot of flexibility because no companies are the same, no processes are the same. So they need a lot of that customization to happen. And there is only a handful of platforms that will accommodate that. And Salesforce being the more, I guess maybe user friendly or easy to understand. I think there's a lot of driver there that why it's picked. And that's where kind of that acceleration happens when they adopt something like that.
Absolutely.
And I think when you think about the evolution of business systems, right, your resources are just much more abundant now. You know, when we open a rec to hire, whether it be a Salesforce admin, developer, or an architect, or BSA for that matter, you just get tons of applicants now. Whereas back in the day, it was tough to find good people. There just weren't as many. So when you think about, building on Salesforce, a solution, you also have to think about resources and capabilities, right? From a person perspective. And so you now have just more people that are capable of building on the platform. So when you look at does a specific application have the features and the capabilities to solve a problem? Do you also have the people to actually maintain it? Is something that you need to consider. And what is the cost of that? And how extensible is it, et cetera. So that's sort of why I think this conversation comes up as an option to go to Salesforce because you generally have more people that know how to do it. Even if you just think about CLM, contract lifecycle management, how many CLM admins do you know? Not that many, right? But you know a bunch of Salesforce admins, and it's easier to hire that. So it's not that Salesforce could solve that CLM problem, but it's just an example of a platform that there's just more resources for.
Do you see that platform, I guess, as the platform is doing more and more, and obviously, people are growing into it, more resources, more people, more engineers, more analysts, more admins. Do you see as the platform's maturing, is there a certain level of complexity as you guys have seen through the evolution of various iterations of the product?
Oh yeah, the complexity is, leaps and bounds from where it used to be. Now it's an entire ecosystem, right? Typically if you're using Salesforce, it's not just Salesforce. You're probably connected to some enterprise data warehouse. There's probably advanced monitoring. You're probably connected to additional ETL tools. I don't know of an instance of Salesforce right now that isn't connected to some other billing system, EDW, or some other product, et cetera, your core product, a marketing system like Marketo, or Pardot, et cetera. It's now, the central platform for a whole ecosystem of platforms.
Do you see from, I guess, when you're looking at platforms, obviously you have, the other cloud platform providers, AWS, GCP, Microsoft, and then you have Salesforce, and a lot is done with the ecosystem behind Salesforce. Do you feel like it's, when people are talking about platforms, is Salesforce kind of bubbling up to kind of start bumping into that? Hey, we're a platform that you can create, build off of kind of in a similar way. Is that starting to become more real for the product?
I don't think that it's popping up because I think it's more complementary.
Complementary.
Yeah, it's two different things, right? Like Salesforce still at core is a transactional database versus a data warehouse. So it's more complementary in the sense that, if you have Salesforce, you're probably pumping that data to an EDW that's collecting data from many, many more sources, right? Which Salesforce is not a good use case for that. So I think it's more complementary than it really butting up against those solutions.
If it's anything, it's actually just being solidified as a pillar in your tech stack, I guess, in enterprise applications. It's almost like every company would need an HRIS system. Now, every company will be asking themselves, what's my CRM? Which one platform it is? Which one's going to be a mainstay? Salesforce tends to be the top, and just like almost side by side with ERP.
I guess the reason I was asking is when you're looking at a company, I guess depending on the company, right? So if you're able to leverage most of the Salesforce cloud ecosystem and you don't need to build anything on your own or create anything net new potentially on an AWS or similar, you become pretty wholly invested in that Salesforce cloud environment. And I guess for those companies maybe who are less software development, focused, they're more maybe, manufacturing or something where they're not maybe creating as much technology. I guess this becomes one of the main pillars. I mean, obviously they have other systems, but as you mentioned, business systems go, this becomes that 360 view of their customer that they're probably aiming for.
Yeah, it's interesting you say pillar because I think you remember we talked about pillars in business systems and Salesforce being one of the pillars, and the other ones sort of being finance systems and HR systems. In the quote unquote Salesforce pillar, it's kind of, unique in the sense that that could be sales, it could be support, it could be a variety of other, you know, use cases. It could be in sometimes HR systems. I know of a pretty well known company that uses Salesforce for their ATS system, and they haven't bought, a traditional ATS platform that you would normally buy. They built it all in Salesforce. One of the projects that we worked on at Uber was actually adding Salesforce to our ATS system. And I'll let you talk about that because he was more the one that drove the architecture on that. But that's also, an area that's outside of your traditional sales and support use case that people are probably familiar with.
Yeah, that's a great example. And it goes with this topic of how the platform is being used for multiple things in areas that you didn't expect. Yes, I did drive that project of, recruiting and complementing the ATS system to drive kind of like sourcing of candidates. That was the project. And it was unique because that's not the prominent area where Salesforce is being used. However, companies are seeing the power of that platform and trying to apply it to different parts of the business application stack. And soon enough, you'll see that more and more happen going to employee management, right? Has nothing to do with customer. You'll see Salesforce starting to have a footprint. Other areas, I've seen companies using it for ERP purposes. So other companies, they're using for accounting purposes. It really depends on the company needs and where, do they have a wide budget to buy all specialized system, or they want to leverage Salesforce to kind of cover different areas of just business operation as a whole. And that's where like the development and the capabilities of platform allow Salesforce to do that. If we were to take away that customization and the tooling and the scalability of it, it would have never happened. And that's why going back to our conversation about hiring, like you have one team who can own one platform that can solve five different parts of the business operation, or do you want five teams with five different platforms that you have to manage? That's always in consideration as the business. They're going to look for the most efficient and most, best bang for the buck, let's call it, to address their needs. And that's why you see this kind of maturing, this path the Salesforce platform is going through. And this Salesforce itself noticed that. And that's why they're starting to build more, going beyond sales and service cloud. They're really venturing the employees and HR side. You're seeing them going into verticals with, let's say, the recent acquisition of Velocity, going by industry, because they know the platform's capable, but they just need to tailor towards some of the features and the design towards that to entice more usage on different parts of the business.
Hey, Chief, let's not encourage people to use Salesforce as an accounting system. Sorry.
Agreed.
As folks that do what we do, that's sort of like an ongoing challenge. Like a lot of companies, will implement Salesforce and they don't have a finance system, you know, and so it's easier for them to run reporting out of Salesforce. So you end up using Salesforce as not only your sales CRM, but like you do a bunch of accounting stuff in there, which is something that we're always trying to undo.
I guess that was going to be one of the questions is, obviously when you have a platform that you can, do anything you want with. I mean, you get the developers, it's a CRM, it can be multi-purpose. Apparently accounting is one of those where maybe you should try to avoid. What are some other things you guys have seen? Like, hey, while it can do this or while we could do this, we probably for, realistic purposes should not.
Like I'll keep it kind of simple. I mean, like Salesforce is transaction, right? So use cases where, you need a lot of historical snapshotting for trending, et cetera. It's just challenging to do in Salesforce, right? Like records change and there's ways to snapshot it, et cetera, but that's not really the core purpose. It's transactional. So when you think about accounting, like you're really, catching the history and capturing the history, et cetera. And so that forces people to do weird things and workarounds, which is unnatural. So it's really when you run into those situations is where then you start to go down these rabbit holes that you probably shouldn't. And don't get me wrong, like sometimes it's necessary for a company to be nimble and move quickly as they ramp up, as they grow, as they hire, et cetera. But again, there's that debt to pay later when you're like, okay, we're a grown-up company now and we need to get a legitimate finance system, et cetera. And we need to unwind what's been done in Salesforce.
Yeah, another common misstep is really using Salesforce as like a substitute of a BI or analytics tool. I have seen it again and again in multiple companies where they're driving more and more data point into Salesforce and they're using it as an interface to explore those data versus kind of taking it offline, have a proper warehouse, have a proper analytics engine that runs through it and derive insights through, let's say, dashboard and reports. That's often too common because it's easy and the easy reports and easy dashboards it. But what becomes a problem is when they start dumping a lot of data that is not necessarily driving anything. It bogs down the system. It makes it hard to configure. It makes it hard to detach different processes out of it. It's almost like what I don't want to see is really seeing Salesforce becoming a dumping ground of all different systems that it's communicating with. That's where like the business application team have to really make these tough decisions. Hey, does this belong here? Is this a transaction or is this something else? And find a better proper system to handle those kind of not very well fitted use cases.
It sounds like when something's easy to use and depending on who has a hand in it, they're going to run with it because it's what they have in front of them. And if it becomes a system of record, like if you guys are mentioning for accounting, where it goes beyond transaction and you want to somehow move it later, that sounds like it's a very painful process. When you were talking about, I guess, New Relic, the 10 years of debt, and you guys had to stop everything for a year. when you're trying to unwind something like, somebody's using it for accounting and migrating it off, I mean, how does that look? Like, is that something that becomes pretty daunting? Like, is that a big, and I'm sure the answer is yes, but like in terms of efforts to make that happen, what does that even look like?
Oh man, it's massive. You've got to get, fortunate for us, we had huge, huge executive support. We had an exec that was insanely supportive of the effort. And I don't think you can actually be successful unless you have that, because it's not only, just re-implementing an application. Like there's a reason why you're moving to a new instance. It's tied into your current processes that need to completely change a lot of times, right? When we talk about the accounting that's happening in Salesforce, you're probably, a lot of people in this industry probably understand it's doing something like negative opportunities, right? That's an entire process that has to change in how you manage opportunities, your renewals process, your deal booking. And that's just sort of core like sales motions, right? A lot of that stuff is probably manual that you want to automate now as you grow. So it is just a massive effort to get people to not only change, which is, can be one of the hardest things, right? People and change, sometimes just it's like oil and water. And then reimagining and re-implementing what that new process looks like in a new instance of Salesforce. And that's not even going into like one of the most challenging parts of re-implementing anything, which is like the data migration. Fundamentally, your data changes too, and you're going to do a lot of data cleaning up. Then you have your integrations. And what we haven't talked about yet is the slew of tools that hook into Salesforce. Anything from like Salesloft, Outreach, the email tools to, LinkedIn Navigator, et cetera, right? If you look at any sales team at any time, there's probably 10 plus, vendors that have hooked into Salesforce for a variety of things. So you've got to re-rationalize, like, are these the right tools that you're using? And, what does the new world look like? There's enablement, there's a cutover. It's a huge effort to do.
Absolutely. When you guys start looking at that, now the different systems that are hooking into Salesforce, and then potentially, Salesforce data is going someplace else, and you start looking at data governance, and you start looking at, setting up, rules and processes around that. Does the number of external systems hooking into it represent a challenge in terms of, establishing a set of data governance and, rules and policies to help ensure data qualities, as high as it can be?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to that, the tech debt that you've incurred, right? In our situation, we had a lot of point-to-point integrations that nobody actually knew what it actually did. At one point, we would turn them off and be prepared to turn them back on to see if it broke anything. We had direct integrations to our core product as well. So yeah, it just, and there was no data governance. So, and then establishing, and that's another challenge. Like, and I'm sure Chi's probably going through this now, is like who actually owns the data, who determines, yes, you can integrate and, manipulate data or retrieve data, et cetera. That's an even more challenging conversation. Yeah, depending on the company. I think back in the day, it was a fairly standard thing like, hey, sales or sales ops owns the data. But in this world, with the way, you know, we've gone digital in the type of analytics and insights that you're looking for, it's not always like clear of who actually owns the data. Since there's so many, dependent groups that can use the data and rely on that data. So it's a much more challenging conversation to have nowadays than it used to
Absolutely. And I guess, with Salesforce now owning Tableau, and you're talking about, people trying to use it to report off of, obviously, there's certain capabilities that Tableau brings to the table that maybe Salesforce wasn't ideally suited for. And yeah, I always try to start thinking about, how people are starting to put these pieces together. Obviously, Salesforce has bought different pieces to provide this whole encompassing view of what a business could do with their applications. And you start chopping and changing and start using different things, it sounds like you get yourself in a whole host of trouble when you're kind of looking at advice, right? Like you guys at larger organizations are looking to provide maybe advice to somebody smaller, just starting with the Salesforce implementation or something like that. Is there something that stands out like, hey, do not do this out the gate because we've done it before and it just doesn't a scale or doesn't work long term?
There's One area I definitely want to caution the folks here is really spend time thinking about how data is stored and how to secure that data. I'm going to talk a lot about data model. It sounds like a trivial concept, but it has a lot to do with incurring tech debt. If you don't do it right, you're not building it right up front, you're not representing how you do business. And if you don't set it up where it's very modular and very scalable, putting a lot of thought into it, you end up going back and doing a lot of redesign, which will have a lot of impact, which will cause a lot of time spent on just undoing those things. So that's why you have to really put more insight when you're first building Salesforce. And that's kind of the blessing and the curse of Salesforce, where it's so easy to build a new field or build a new object and relate them together. You don't think about it too much. But as you mature and your business gets complicated, you're going to see those flaws. And at one point, like what Young said, his company realized this doesn't work at all. And we have to redo the whole thing. And it's going to cost us a year and many million dollars to do. That's a pitfall of being easy to use. And that's why like spend up more time, think about how your business working a call at its core and kind of build around that upfront.
I couldn't agree more. And specifically that data model. I won't say the names of the companies, but I can rattle off probably 10 tech companies that everybody's familiar with that has the same data problems. And specifically, one of the pitfalls that folks make is mimicking the data architecture of the actual product that they're selling. And so that's what happened to New Relic and a number of other companies, right? So instead of really thinking about how are you actually using the data in Salesforce, you just sort of, mimic whatever data architecture you have in your core product. And that tends to lead to problems because that's not actually how you use Salesforce to actually sell or support customers. And so to Chief's point, you really need to be thoughtful about that data architecture because that does impact how you actually build out everything else and how you actually implement your processes around that too. Specifically around account data, like that typically, like for a lot of startups, I think they make a huge mistake with that just becomes really messy. And you end up having to clean that up down the road.
So I guess when, to avoid some of these problems, when you're, I guess, who should most ideally be, I mean, before there's a, manager of business applications, right? That person doesn't exist. But, typically who's best suited for, helping drive some of that data model early days of implementation?
You hire Chi. So yeah, that's how do you answer that question? Because I think there's not a single answer because you need somebody with experience like myself and Chi, but you also need to partner with the business because it's really driven on how you're using that data, right? If we just go back to the traditional sales use case, how are you selling a customer? Is it an enterprise customer? Is it a high transaction commercial use case? Is it SMB, right? That's really going to determine how you use that data. And then you really need to understand, how the data is being used in order to understand, like, you know, we need to know, at X company that we're selling to four different divisions. And within those divisions, there's these different geos, for example, maybe, right? That's just a random example, but that's really going to determine that. But you need somebody technical that knows the platform to be able to partner with somebody on the business that can explain this is actually how we actually sell from a sales use case.
Yeah, a lot of times I guess the implementation partner might be doing that, playing that role, and they're going to leave. And again, going back to the extensibility of the product, somebody is going to be the quote unquote the administrator, and next time there's functionality needed, they might be tapped to figure out how to implement it without going back to either one of two guys like you both, or to back to consulting company. And sounds like that could be a very easy way to start getting yourself in trouble if you're not kind of thinking about the design and you're just kind of adding what's needed because the business is like, hey, we need this, and you're like, yeah, I can do that, and you're like, I'm going to kick the can, like you mentioned, down the road.
And this just goes back to like how teams should be built, the biz apps team. Like it can't be all administrator and developer. It can't all be just kind of business running the show. You have to have skill set that can blend the two, who knows both. And what Young and I did well was really building out like a business system analyst kind of role that kind of can facilitate those two conversations, the engineering and the business conversation. Ideally, you will have an architect that can rethink through it. But if you're really scrappy and you're like, you're not at that scale yet, a BSA will do wonders in helping at least kind of having those honest conversations versus like, hey, here's what I need. And then you go turn around and you build it right away.
Awesome. Guys, I was cognizant of the time. I know we're kind of bumping at the end of our allotted time with you. And I want to say this has really been fantastic because both of your point of views, I mean, you're both experts, obviously, in business applications. I've seen this in all sizes of well known tech companies. And I really appreciate you both coming on and sharing. If someone has a follow up question, if somebody wants to reach out with additional thought on something, is LinkedIn a good place to hit either one of you up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Same here.
Okay, awesome. We'll put your LinkedIn profiles into the show notes. And if anybody has a follow up, feel free to reach out to either person. And that's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guests, different topic. And until then, always ask for two things. One, keep sharing and subscribing. The podcast has been growing and it's been awesome. So tell people about it because we're growing organically and it's been a real interesting journey thus far. And secondly, if you other topics you want to hear about, I mentioned ServiceNow. Somebody reached out regarding that. We just recorded one and released one just in the last week or two. That's what I'm looking for. So hit me up on LinkedIn for that. And until next time, thanks.